For 40 years, Aberdeen has been known as the oil and gas capital of Europe. Now it aims to be the net zero capital of Europe. But how do we get there? And what does a just transition mean for all of us? Let's find out. Welcome to a special debate night. Good evening. With just over 20 years to reach our net zero commitment, Scotland is already halfway there. To get to net zero will mean action by all of us and changes to all our lives. But are we ready for it, and are we willing to do what's required? Helping us explore that on our panel this evening, from the Scottish Government, the Minister for Energy and the Environment, Gillian Martin. SNP MSP for Aberdeenshire East, Gillian, has said that climate change is this generation's nuclear war, but we should remain optimistic about Scotland's role. From Scottish Labour, spokesperson for Net Zero, Energy and Just Transition, Sarah Boyack. MSP for Lothian, Sarah was first elected to Holyrood over 20 years ago when she served in Donald Dewar's cabinet as Minister for Transport and Environment. The director of the Robert Gordon University Energy Transition Institute, Professor Paul Leeuw. Paul has over 30 years' experience in the global energy sector and previously worked for Centrica Energy. He said that retaining offshore oil and gas supply chain is crucial to delivering net zero. Also with us tonight, Kerr, the Scottish Conservative MSP for the North East of Scotland. Appointed as the party's spokesperson for education and skills this year, Liam had previously been spokesperson for net zero, energy and transport, and has said that climate change is arguably one of the biggest threats to humanity on Earth. And finally, energy and climate activist Sepi Golzari-Munro. Until recently, she was the director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Sepi originally studied law, but went on to work with think tanks, NGOs and the UK government to raise awareness of all the issues we are going to talk about here this evening. Please welcome them all to Debate Night. And of course, welcome to our studio audience here in Aberdeen. It's great to have you with us for this special programme this evening. And you can join in the discussion from home, wherever you are in Scotland. The hashtag is BBCDN on social media. And give us a follow at BBC Debate Night. Now, we're going to split the programme this evening into three main areas, focusing on transport, the biggest cause of emissions in Scotland, heating also a big factor in that as well. And of course, because we're here in Aberdeen this evening, oil and gas. And that's where we start this evening with our first question, which comes from Scott Reid. Scott, good evening.
How do you propose to balance the climate targets with the need for jobs in sectors like oil and gas, especially during a cost of living crisis?
Thank you, Scott. 1 in 5 jobs directly employed in oil and gas here in Aberdeen. Gillian Martin, you know well about the importance of this, don't you? Because your father came to the North East from Clydeside because there was no just transition down there in terms of jobs. Jobs are key up here. Absolutely.
And that very question that's just been asked, that's the thing that actually really motivates me. Motivated me when I was a backbencher. I was asking that very same question. I was making sure that just transition was at the top of the priorities of the government. And that's a transition that we need to accept the fact that in oil and gas, we're the envy of the world in terms of our skills, particularly in a marine environment, a hostile marine environment. And we need to look at the skills that those oil and gas workers have got, those transferable skills, and make the path for them to be working across the energy sector, not just in oil and gas, but in renewables as well. And let's face it, oil and gas is going to be with us for a number of years to come until we're in a position to stop burning fossil fuels for our everyday lives. So we have to recognise that we are the envy of the world in terms of the skills and expertise that we've got, particularly in Aberdeen, and make it easier for these people to transition. And they may not just transition once into renewables, they might go back and forth between projects, because this is going to be a transition.
It's easy to say that, but how do we actually make it happen? So
one of the things, I mean, I guess we have to give, I suppose, a roadmap about what we're doing in terms of energy in particular. So one of the things that the Scottish Government has done is the ScotWind leasing round. So we're actually showing that we want to have 28 gigawatts potential offshore floating wind. And that is going to, be projects that are going to be right across the top of Scotland and right down the east as well. So we're given that certainty that we're looking to transition, because the thing about oil and gas in the North Sea basin and even the west of Shetland is it's depleting. And every company that's working in that sector knows that it's going to become more expensive and more difficult to extract what's already there. That's aside from the climate change argument. Even an economic argument there knows that it is a very mature basin. So if we don't invest in offshore renewables, because we've got this brilliant opportunity to retain our status as an energy capital if we put investment into the next wave of energy that's going to come across, but we make sure that that oil and gas expertise is retained, because it's going to be those companies and those people that are working in the offshore oil and gas that are going to take us to net zero in the next wave of energy, particularly floating offshore
And
wind.
what those companies want is certainty about where we're going. And what people who work in oil and gas and energy in this room want is certainty about where they're going. Are they getting that from Labour at the moment?
Oh, absolutely, because we want us to be a clean energy superpower, to use those skills and experience we've already got in the oil and gas sector that will be with us for decades, but also to make that just transition to renewables.
Well, but hang on, you're saying you won't stop any of the licences that have been given out by the current government, but you're not going to issue any new ones. Where's the certainty in that?
Absolutely. Well, it's saying to industry, invest in renewables, invest in the infrastructure, in our green ports, in the jobs that we're currently seeing being developed off the shore of Scotland every day of the week. I'm meeting energy companies all the time. Some of them have got oil and gas interests and renewables, and some of them are only renewables. So it's a huge transition, and it's all about bringing down our energy bills, getting more jobs in Scotland, getting green industry in Scotland, so we build our renewables tech in Scotland. We don't just import it. There's a huge opportunity here to be a leader in the world. In the same way that we were with oil and gas for years, this is the big transition that's happening. You speak to workers in the oil and gas sector, they want to know what's coming next, both in terms of their jobs, but in for the future. And you're now beginning to see oil and gas joining up with renewables. I met a company who's powering oil and gas platform, and it's going to reduce their carbon emissions. So it's how we reduce our carbon emissions, create the green jobs, but also bring people's energy bills down. And that's not what we're getting from the Tories at the moment.
Okay.
So we need that certainty for investment.
These are real jobs and for real people in the room here this evening. Lady in the green top.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the energy transmission into the national grid. So I think the National Grid did a report earlier this year or last year, and they've identified that we're going to need to basically increase our transmission infrastructure by about 5 times what we've built in the last 30 years. So I think the UK and Denmark are already world leaders in offshore wind. So those renewables projects are going ahead and they're developing, and I myself work in both oil and gas and renewables for engineering consultancy. I can see those transition happening, but my concern is what would we do as a country with all that electricity that we're generating?
That's a really interesting point, Paul de Leeuw, because I think we're going to need something like 5 times the amount of pylons that we've got at the moment to transmit this energy around the country. I drove up here from the Central Belt today, past sign after sign saying no to pylons, and that's where we are at the moment. The national grid is going to have to change dramatically to cope with all of this.
Yeah, let me combine both the job question and your question around activity, right? Because they are linked. Currently, as heard, 1 in 5 of the jobs in the northeast of Scotland are in offshore energy. It's 1 in 30 in Scotland, right? So if this industry doesn't work, we have a real issue, not here, but across Scotland. The amount of activity we need to do is huge, right? So to get the targets outlined by the current government, but also by opposition parties, give you a flavour of what needs to be done. We need to install 1.2 wind turbines every single day for the next decade. That's what we need to do. We're not doing that. We need to put an electrolyser in every couple of days. We're not doing that. So if you start saying is we have the big ambition, the big targets, we do need a very clear plan, a very clear focus, what we need to do, investment behind it, to actually build the pylons, build the capacity, build the grid, go fast. That is what's going to retain the jobs. That's what's going to retain the supply chain, the capacity here. That's the big prize for Scotland and for the UK to go.
So the grid is the key to this?
It's part of it. It is actually, we need to build the actual wind farms, the carbon capture and storage plant, the hydrogen facilities, but also sustain the oil and gas industry, because actually that's where the workforce and supply chain companies come from to actually build all the new infrastructure. This is about a complex puzzle of making it together. This is about integrated planning, collaboration between industry and government and regulators to make it happen.
Liam Kerr.
I think on the jobs issue, I find what we've heard quite extraordinary, actually, because, of course, when Sarah Boyack talks about what's coming down the track, a Labour government has said that there'll be no further exploration in the North Sea. The roadmap that Gillian Martin talks about, well, there is one. It's called a draft energy strategy, which was supposed to have been finalised already, but has not been. And it won't be, I think, until next summer.
They would say that's because of the Westminster government and the decisions that Rishi Sunak has taken.
Well, then they'd be wrong, wouldn't they, as the Climate Change Committee pointed out today. And the point about that roadmap is that it expressly contains a presumption against new exploration and production in the North Sea. So, respectfully, for my SNP and Labour colleagues to sit here and suggest that all will be well with them, I think is slightly misleading. And I think the gentleman makes a very important point. There are various estimates, but there might be around 90,000 jobs directly connected to the oil and gas industry in Scotland. 95% of those are right here in the northeast. So it's a very real issue for us. This is not speculation. This is not hypothetical. For us up here, that question is the most important. And I have to say, I think the way that Paul de Leeuw answered it when he's talking about the importance of the North Sea, but talking about the fair and managed transition, bringing on new technologies, utilising our excellent colleges that we're sitting in right now, utilising the talent that we already have here, that is how we get to a proper, fair and managed transition and protect the jobs that the gentleman quite rightly brings up.
Thank you. Lady up there. Yes.
Thank you. So I've had the privilege to work in oil and gas, and now I'm transitioning into renewables. I'm doing a master's degree at RGU in energy management.
He's not your teacher, is he? By any chance? No,
thank God, no.
Just checking.
So I've had the privilege to see both sides of the story, and the challenges. We talk about an industry today that has 200,000 jobs, direct or indirect. Now, how are you going to make sure that these folks have meaningful jobs, not just jobs, because they're not apples to apples? And if you look at the renewable energy today, you look at these jobs, they're mainly, first of all, they're not the same amount of, it's not like for like, so you're not swapping one for one. They're different skill sets. So rightly, we have to, upgrade a lot of skills and upgrade a lot of people. But also, don't forget, today, this industry generates X amount of tax. I'm not going to say it on live TV, but X amount of income tax that goes to national insurance and X amount of tax that goes in corporate tax related. So a plea to our politicians, please don't sugarcoat this. This is livelihoods. This is people behind it. This is families. Don't turn this into another Sheffield, please.
Thank you. Sepi, I'll come to you in a second. Let me just take some more views. Man with the glasses here. Yeah.
You say you want to continue drilling oil and gas in Scotland, but all this oil and gas gets sold on the global market, and it doesn't give Scotland the energy security that we need with renewable sources.
Or the lower prices.
Well, exactly. Would renewable sources not upskill these jobs in the oil and gas and also give us some energy security and cheaper bills?
Thank you. Thank you. Lady down here. Yeah.
If 1 out of 5 people in the Northeast work in oil and gas, that means that 4 out of 5 people don't work in oil and gas. So I'm wondering, what does renewable energy look like for the regular average homeowner? What kind of energy will we be using in our homes?
We're going to come on to that, hopefully, in our next discussion. Sepi Golzari-Munro, on that lady's point up the back there, are the politicians sugarcoating this?
Well, I think before answering that question, I'd just like to go back to the original gentleman who used the word, how do we balance our climate targets? Using the word balance, how do we balance those with the need for quality jobs up in the northeast, many of which are in the oil and gas sector? And to answer that question, and most of the audience will know this, but for the audience at home, we need to look at a couple of facts. And the facts are that, moralising aside, political point scoring aside, corporate lobbying aside, the geology of the North Sea tells us that, it's a mature basin. It's we've been working there for decades now. I think oil peaked 2 decades ago, gas peaked in 1999, 2000. So the geology is telling us that, where it's a finite resource. Then we're looking at industry figures which tell us that output from the North Sea is going to decrease by 95 to 97% over the next 2 decades as well. So that's nothing to do with targets, that's just to do with physical material reality. So with those facts, The word balance, I suppose, I would change that. Is that what are climate targets to us? They're not a burden in this context. They're actually a lifeline, to this lady's point. And we need to think actually about the investments that need to happen today to make sure that the skills that are already up here are being used effectively. Now, we know, North East, we know that Scotland has got the best carbon storage potential, much of which is up here. We know that we need hydrogen for the future electricity system. We know that. So there's a lot that can be done, but I feel that this isn't being worked on effectively because there's a lot of political point scoring happening. We saw down in Westminster.
So you don't think politicians are sugarcoating this? They're not telling us the truth about what needs to happen here?
Well, the truth is that the North Sea resource is finite and it's depleted, and that they need to make the investment and attract international investment into Scotland and into the UK. Now, the way we need to do that, and I really want to focus on this here, is that until 2021, the UK was the largest offshore wind market in the world. We were overtaken by China in 2021, but we were the biggest offshore wind market. So investors didn't really have that much of a choice about where to go. They kind of had to come here if they wanted to invest in offshore wind. Now, the global market is booming. We are seeing countries such as Australia, the United States, European countries, they're all going after offshore wind. So if you're an international investor, you need certainty from politicians that this is where you should invest your money. And so we need Holyrood and Westminster to really collaborate on this issue. Energy is a reserved matter. It's dealt with mainly in Westminster, but I just don't feel like there's necessarily been a voice for Scotland down there effectively that's not just been making political points, but actually going forward with the economy up here.
OK, Scott, you asked the question, have you had any reassurance from what you've heard from the panel?
Some. I think that, like everything, I think we're always tied between the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament, just trying to get points scoring over each other rather than focusing on the issue. I also have a question of, with oil and gas companies posting record profits, should they be the ones that are paying for some of this transition?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Come back to that in a second. Man in the green here, yes.
A lot of this that's been said so far makes no sense. In the long term, Indonesia's prohibiting the export of nickel. Chile's nationalizing lithium. They're reducing, making it harder to mine copper. Malaysia's just announced they're going to prohibit the export of strategic minerals. So if you're building a future, you have to build a balanced energy picture. And as far as oil and gas, the reduce and the rate of reduction is on how you tax it and deliver it. In 1956, the U.S. implemented the depletion allowance because oil was selling at 54 cents a barrel, and they wanted a secure, stable supply of energy. They gave 25% of the income to the companies to invest in it. So when you take a look holistically, the jobs that you're talking about are service jobs. The technology that's going to drive the future, bioreactors, even in hydrogen, I've yet to see anything in Scotland that actually addresses, do we go small scale, large scale? And if you go large scale on a global basis, what's an acceptable fugitive emission rate for hydrogen when it's a secondary greenhouse gas?
OK, thank you, thank you. Man at the back, yes.
Yeah, I think there seems to be almost a little bit of a disconnect when we're talking about these jobs as well. So the panel's talked about the need and the fact that there will be oil and gas in one form or another, but it seems to be very focused on production, and we're not also looking at decommissioning. Is there a danger that the language that we're using, we're talking about this skill set that we have in the North East and across Scotland, but by using this language, particularly, it seems to come across very negatively about how this is a depleting zone, a depleting field. We're actually chasing away potential future future talent that are going to be dealing with a lot of the environmental challenges that we're going to be having in the next 2-3 decades.
Thank you, thank you. Your views on everything you hear on the programme tonight. The hashtag is BBCDN on social media. We've got a lot to get through this evening, so I want to move on to our second question tonight, which comes from Lee McMillan. Lee, good evening.
Hi. How can individuals in Scotland be encouraged and supported to make lifestyle changes that contribute to reducing their carbon footprint.
Thank you, Lee. This is a good opportunity maybe to focus in on transport, the largest cause of domestic emissions here in Scotland. Traffic volumes still growing. Sarah Boyack, transport, you know all about this. You were due to come from Edinburgh by train to be with us here tonight, but you ended up doing it by taxi from Dundee.
Halfway, because the railway line wasn't working tonight. And it's actually the third train journey I've done recently, which was either cancelled or delayed. I was stuck on a train, there was no electricity. So we need to have resilient transport that people can rely on. I would be putting more investment in our trains, and we've got to think about how we power them for the future to decarbonise them. But we also need more buses, so you've got a choice. I love the fact that we followed up why I introduced free bus passes for the over 60s with the under 22s. But you need a bus to be able to use, and you need to be able to have choices. And I'd like to see more low emission cars, but also more rail freight. I'd like to see the transition in terms of lorries, in terms of how we get our goods. And then there's homes as well, homes and transport. They're the two areas we really need to be focusing on. So I would like to see a local power plan so that we're reducing the carbon emissions from our homes, and we've got the wettest, coldest, dampest houses in Europe. So I would do a mix of supporting people to have more energy efficient homes, and that Scottish Government and local government need to work together.
We'll come on to homes in just a second, but on transport specifically, what do we need to be doing better?
Better railways, more investment in railways. There's still more railway lines that we could be doing in Scotland, upgrading them. But buses are absolutely critical for most people's day-to-day journeys, but also making access to low-emission cars much more affordable. They're really expensive at the moment. So I would have continued with the target down south to get rid of new cars, make new cars energy efficient. And business needs that certainty, needs to invest. We need to bring down the prices for people, but it's all of those things. And active travel, walking and cycling where it works. Right.
That's
a lot of infrastructure.
That's a good point to ask. We're in Aberdeen city centre tonight. Put your hands up if you came here by public transport this evening. Wow. Maybe 10 people out of an audience of 70 people. The rest of you, hands up if you came here by private car here this evening. OK, there's your problem, Gillian Martin. What's going on?
Because I bet you a lot of those people were from Aberdeenshire, am I right? So, and I agree with pretty much everything that Sarah Boyack has said, apart from one thing, and obviously Sarah's from a different part of Scotland, she's from Lothians, and I'm from a very rural part of Aberdeenshire. And I think this is why the issue about cars is important, and can't demonise cars, because if you live in a rural area, you might not have that access to a train station. You might not have that access, not so much to a bus service, but the bus service might not work for you. So, for example, I live out in Aberdeenshire, and the bus services are radial. They go into the city centre all the time. So if you are in Ellen, but you work in, I don't know, you work in Bankery, you would have to go from Ellen into Aberdeen City, get a bus and go out to Bankery. So basically, that rules out you actually working there, because you would spend your whole time on a bus, for example, and they're quite expensive as well. You would have to have a car. So you're ruling out employment options as well. So I think it's really important that we look at a mix of solutions here.
So Rishi Sunak was quite right when he spoke up and said we need to stop demonising car drivers.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe I've
That's what he said.
But I have to say that if he had said that, and then he had said, as Sarah said, he hadn't rolled back on the sort of the promise that he was going to make it more difficult. I think he was going to ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars by a certain point. And that's going to incentivise the market for electric cars. But of course, with electric cars, we have to have more of the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure as well. I think one of the things, I'm lucky enough to have an electric car, and I'm lucky enough to have a parking space, so I actually was able to get a home charging point. What about people that are maybe in flats? They need to look at maybe having charging points.
We're supposed to have 30,000 by 2030. We've got less than 5,000.
But you know what I would argue as well, and this is not going to make me very popular with people that live in some of our big cities of Scotland. People in big cities in Scotland do not need a car. If you live in Edinburgh City, you've probably got one of the best bus services in the whole of the UK. you do not really need a car, particularly because you can get home delivery for supermarket shopping, whatever.
So they should be
But
giving up their car.
If you live out in Strichen, you need a car. And if you don't have a car, we're talking about a just transition here. If we do the wrong thing in this area, we'll penalise people in rural areas and make it very difficult. And we've already got a drain of people coming from rural areas, particularly young people. If you don't have that infrastructure there, then you're going to lose people to the
hold
big
that thought,
cities.
Gillian. Man in the front row.
I welcome everything that's just been said. I completely agree with 99% of it, except for the not demonising cars. Study after study has shown, and if you look at cities like Copenhagen, anywhere in the Netherlands, etc., where active transport has grown, you need to make car use inconvenient in order to have an alternative. So while there is a place for cars, Scotland is a rural country to a large extent. We do need a modal shift, and for that, we need to make cars more inconvenient.
Okay, no, hang on a second. Paul's going to tell us about the Netherlands in just a second. But gentleman in the white shirt there, yes, on you go.
Yeah, so the lack of train services in Aberdeenshire is testament to the fact how, on a UK level, Scotland is a second-class citizen. Because had we been in the south of England, there'd be a train network. I go every month I do a clinic in Banff, and I pass by Udney Station. There's a station hotel in Cullen. And I lament the fact that we are deprived of that resource that is taken for granted in the south. And that's another reason why I support independence for Scotland.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row here, yes.
I live in Peterhead, or perhaps I ought to say I bide in the Blue Toon. And to my certain knowledge, there are now in the town of Peterhead 3 charging points for electric vehicles. Can I ask if measures are in place to incentivize people to provide more charging points?
OK, we'll pick up on that. But Paul, just on that gentleman there's first point, the Dutch experience of this is interesting. Way ahead when it comes to electric vehicles, way ahead when it comes to charging points as well. What are we missing here?
Yeah, I mean, different country, different issues, right? I mean, Netherlands is far more compact, easier infrastructure, but a big learning, right? Because people actually do like to cycle, they do like to use public transport, and again, we can learn from that. And Aberdeen is a great example. We got 24 electric buses here, we've got 15 hydrogen buses here. You know, actually, we can make this happen. But we are addicted to our cars. 5.5 million people in Scotland, 3 million vehicles in Scotland. It's quite incredible where we are and not very electrified. So actually, if we want to make a change, it is not just about the transport change and all the things that Gillian talked about earlier around how we do travel. We also have to make a lifestyle change, how we actually want to move around. Because at the moment, it's not working here and we can't decarbonize unless we sort it out.
Sepi, how do we make that happen? I mean, we've got ultra-low emission zones coming here and other cities. How do we push that faster?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say I think we're ignoring the fact that some of the lowest income households don't own cars, actually. So we need to remember that. So they rely on public transport. And I'm not sure that public transport in Scotland is really up to scratch at all in terms of the bus services, the rail services. That's what people are relying on to get into towns. Secondly, you know, we are going, you know, the phase out of selling of petrol and diesel cars was from 2035, has now been moved to 2030, but doesn't really actually make that much difference because there's still a zero emissions vehicle mandate on the car manufacturers. They're still starting to see a big uptick in the sale of electric vehicles, and the second-hand electric vehicle market is going to be booming in the next 2 or 3 years as electric vehicles start passing into that market. I mean, most people in the country actually buy their cars second-hand anyway, so the costs will come down in that respect as well.
But if we don't have the charging points, I mean, we're so far behind in terms of the targets for charging.
Yeah, I mean, we are 70% of households can actually use residential charging. That's the figure across the UK, but that doesn't address the people that can't. And I think that's the problem with a lot of the stuff is that you have to make the choices now. You have to put the policies in place now to make sure that everybody can access it. And that's about policy choices. That's not about technology choices. So I think let's be clear on that. We can move to lower emissions in transport. We can do it. We just need to make the right policy decisions now.
And make sure the trains run as well. Gentleman with the beard there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all well and good talking about car use and bus use. There's a lot of talk about, the 20-minute neighbourhood or the 15-minute neighbourhood, where councils across the country are closing facilities. In Aberdeen, libraries have been closed by the council. Swimming pools have been closed, and you have to get the bus into town. And if you've got mobility issues, where you can only fit one wheelchair on a bus at a time, it does make it very difficult. And then you've got the whole aspect of when you are out and about, walking in town, walking from one place to the other. If you do have mobility issues, it's very difficult. The amount of times I've nearly tipped my partner out of her wheelchair because there's a pothole on the pavement, or a curb that's, not very accessible. There needs to be more investment in actually making places easier to walk about.
Thank you. Lady over there. Yes.
Do we need to have a discussion about renationalising our public transport system? Because a lot of the countries you go to in Europe who have very efficient services are nationalised.
Thank you. Leeuw and Kerr, is it time to renationalise transport to get to net zero the way we need to?
I'll speak about trains in 2 seconds. I'd like to take that point.
No, answer that lady's point about renationalisation.
So we've renationalised rail in this country, and despite me and many others campaigning, including Gillian Martin, actually, to be fair, campaigning for North East Rail back up to Peterhead and the Broch, it's not happening. I've campaigned for new stations at Cove and Newton Hill to get the modal shift that we heard about. It's not happening under this Scottish Government. And the nationalised rail operator is about to cut 15% of your trains between Inverurie and Aberdeen. Why? In order to increase access to the Central Belt. So if you want genuine modal shift in the North East, then I'm not sure nationalisation is going to deliver it.
And do you agree when Rishi Sunak talked about us demonising car drivers and accepting that cars have got a big place in our future? Do you agree with that?
I agree, actually, with Gillian Martin that if you're going to live outside Aberdeen in some of the excellent places that surround Aberdeen in the North East, you need to be able to get in. Now, Sarah Boyack talks about moving to electric vehicles, but as you pointed out, the suggestion is that we need 30,000 charge points by, I think, 2030. We are currently on a track whereby we won't have enough charge points until 2042. And even if they are there, as perhaps the gentleman from Peterhead will testify, half of them don't work anyway, as discovered by the P&J when they tried to take a van from Wick all the way down to the Central Belt. So I'm afraid we've got much bigger issues here in terms of getting the charge points in and making sure they're repaired once they break.
Thank you. Lady in the glasses. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's really not a one-size-fits-all, picking up Gillian's point. We really need an urban strategy and a rural strategy because it's two very different lifestyles and two separate types of communities that we need to give opportunities to. Otherwise, it's not going to work. If we dilute it and do one fits for both, one or the other is going to, it's not going to have the same impact. So you need city centre type strategies and you need those to support the rural communities at the same time as well.
Have we in the audience tonight any electric car owners who would like to share their experience, especially... Oh, yeah, OK, down in the front row. We haven't heard from this gentleman down here, so tell us all about it, sir.
Well, thank you. I live in Aberdeenshire. I'm lucky enough to have an electric car, and again, I've got my own charging point, so I seldom use public chargers. I think it's great. I do save quite a bit on travelling, but one point I was wanting to make earlier, for the outlying settlements within Aberdeenshire, there is other options, and that could be like car clubs. Buses from where I live to Aberdeen's maybe every hour and a half. If we take Gillian's example in Bankery, I do know at least 2 car club cars there, and that's maybe a change of mindset that needs to be... We speak about affordability of cars. Well, it's just like hiring a car for the time you need it. And that's possibly a mindset change that we as the public need to make.
Car clubs and car sharing. Lee, you asked the question. What do you think?
I'm not a car owner. And I think a lot of the discussion has been about cars. I think the public transport we really need to get better links, but also a huge difference between us and the Netherlands is the cycle lanes. To cycle in Aberdeen is, you're possibly having a death wish sometimes, and I think there's no demonising. We don't want to demonise cars. Cyclists are constantly demonised. People always whinge about the cyclists, but actually, you know, like legally you're meant to, is it 2 meters? You're not, like, I can touch a lot of the cars that are trying to overtake me if I'm cycling to work, kind of thing. And it is like, yeah, so that's my little...
Thank you, thank you. Your views on all of this? The hashtag is BBCDN on social media. We're in Aberdeen tonight, our last show of this year, but we're back in January. So if you'd like to be part of the audience for shows next year with a general election coming down the line towards us, just keep an eye on the website for future locations. They will be up there soon. Let's go to our third question of the night, which comes from Lorna McHattie. Lorna, evening.
Evening. It's easy for people to support moving forward towards carbon neutral until the reality of what it means dawns on them. Heat exchange boilers are expensive, and I don't think that they're going to heat our homes in the north adequately, not with our granite walls. Is it time to scrap carbon neutral targets until technology can deliver cost-effective options?
Lorna, what's been your experience of this? Have you explored making the change?
No, I haven't. All I've heard so far is that it's going to be more expensive to have one of these new boilers. But more importantly for me, I think, many of us live in granite homes in Aberdeen, and I certainly do. And the heat just leaches out of our walls, no matter what else you do in terms of trying to insulate doors, windows, lofts, etc. So my concern would be that I'm never going to be able to heat my house adequately. OK, thank you. And also the Chartered Institute Building have said 2 out of 5 people won't be able to afford to make the switch to heat pumps. Sepi, what do we do about that?
Yep. Well, thank you so much for your question, because it gives the opportunity to address a few of the concerns, really. And I think the first one I'd say is that, you know, Norway, half of their households have heat pumps. 20 million heat pumps in Europe. The US last year sold more heat pumps than it did gas boilers. So this is actually mature technology in other places. It's just that the market hasn't been created in the UK for it.
Who's going to pay for it?
Hold on. 85% of homes use gas boilers at the moment. So I think that's where you're talking about carbon neutral targets. So this is where targets come in. And the target from the UK level is for 2035 phase out of new gas boilers. So that gives us how many years? That gives us more than a decade to have that technology cost curve come down. When you've got targets, you allow businesses to make investments into the supply chain, and that brings the cost curve down to make these things more affordable. But at the moment, if you do want to do it both north and south of the border, there are grants available to start getting the market going.
But they won't make the full cost. Well, I mean, it's £30 billion roughly to change here in Scotland. Who should pick up the bill for that? So
there are grants at the moment to get the technology down for the households that want to make the shift now. And there's Octopus Energy that's really doing a lot of innovation on this. They're bringing the cost of heat pumps down already. 2022 saw already a reduction in cost of heat pumps. But the key thing is all of this is opt-in. Nobody's going to make you tear out your gas boiler. And the reason the target date is so far ahead is so that the businesses can get the supply chains going. Scotland actually already has some manufacturing in this area. Businesses can get the supply chains going, but they can bring the costs down. And then the next time you need to replace your gas boiler, that's when you go for the heat pump. So, you know, we don't need to get scared, and there's a lot of fear-mongering out there about heat pumps, some of which has been called out by the Competition and Markets Authority, saying that many gas boiler companies are misleading the public about heat pumps. So thank you so much for your question, because there are a lot of myths out there.
Right, but Paul DeLeeuw, you go home tonight, bad news, the boiler's broken, OK? You get the engineer round, he says, your gas boiler's done, you need a new boiler. What are you going to buy tomorrow, Paul?
I mean, I would love to go for a heat pump, but I can't, because I don't have a solution for an old house I have currently. And that is the issue we have in Scotland. half our homes are older than 60 years old or more than that. It's a real problem. But it's not just, again, as building on Sepi's point, it's not just about the technology of the boiler. You need to have your home insulation working. You need to have make sure you have enough radiators in there. You need to make sure that the electricity price is right, because currently the electricity price is linked to the gas price, right? So we basically pay 4 times as much for electricity as we pay for gas. If you want to make heat pumps work, you're going to have to sort the electricity market, because then it becomes efficient. There's a lot to be done, right? But this is the opportunity. If we get it right, we can make this a heat pump powerhouse if we want to get it right. And I think there's a real opportunity to do this, because other countries have already done it. Sepi already mentioned it. We know how to do it. Technology exists. But this requires an integrated, logical plan, policy to implement it, and giving the people who need it most the support to get the heat pumps in the houses.
OK, we'll come back in a second. Man in the blue shirt down here. Yes.
Thank you. Half of the stock in Scotland is either flatted and in mixed ownership. So what we really need is a coordinated approach to give powers to local authorities to perhaps implement the old scheme called the Housing Action Areas, to bring in a coordinated approach to tackling the problem that will affect all housing tenures, not just the private, not just social rented.
Thank you. Gentleman on the front down here. Yes?
Professor Leeuw nailed our situation absolutely. Several years ago, we had quotes and consultations about solar panels and heat pumps. In both cases, the cost was well outside what we could afford, and I was advised by experts who weren't trying to sell me a new system that the benefit would be pretty small, would take years, decades, to actually see a significant improvement in our cost of heating.
OK, thank you. Liam Kerr.
Yeah, Lauren is absolutely right how she framed the question, because it's one thing to get a heat pump at £10,000, give or take, as against a gas boiler, as against, let's say, somewhere between 2,500 and 4,000. But it's then the loft insulation. I mean, these are houses in Aberdeen, right? Granite houses, loft insulation, you've got your wall insulation, you're adding maybe £15,000, £20,000 onto that. Now, the cost, the answer to the question who's going to pay for this, right, is you. Because when the minister, when I've asked this question, the cost was estimated at £33 billion to decarbonise heat in buildings. That's about two and a half years ago that figure was done. I've asked for what the inflation-linked figure is. Answer came there, none. The Scottish Government is putting £1.8 billion towards this over 5 years. They've actually only paid out, I think, about £175,000 at this point. But the reality is the other £31.5 billion, before you add inflation, is going to be met, when I've asked the Minister, by all of you. So that's your answer. It's going to be very expensive to do it, as Lorna points out. Who's going to pay? All of you.
So, Gillian Martin, is that why we had roughly 5,000 heat pump systems installed in Scotland last year in a nation of over 2 million households? Is that why we're so behind the curve on this?
So I want to address what Lorna was saying as well. I have a similar house, I think, to Lorna has, and I would love to have a heat pump, but it just wouldn't work in my house. And in terms of wall insulation, you can't really put wall insulation in the granite house because they're granite walls, you know, and so and it's not enough just to put it in the loft. I could talk all night long about hydrogen, because I think hydrogen is a possibility. I would like to see the targets for injection of hydrogen into the existing gas grid of at least 20%. Now, we haven't had the UK government have to look at the possibility of that. It can be done. There's actually another project, there's an actual pilot project in Fife called H100, where they are actually got 300 houses that are going to be hydrogen heating only.
So wait a minute, should we not be talking about heat pumps?
No, we should be talking about heat pumps for the houses which they're going to work. But we should be talking about other solutions for the likes of the older stock and very remote and rural stock, for example, that aren't even on the gas grid, who are the most fuel poor in the whole of the UK, incidentally. It comes back to that earlier point about the infrastructure for all the electricity that we're going to be producing from wind turbines. We're going to have an excess of that electricity. What can we do with it? We can make hydrogen. And can we use that? We can use that for deindustrialisation.
Sorry, but isn't this hugely confusing for people? We're in a climate emergency. This is a climate crisis special tonight, and we're saying to them, you can go down the road of heat pumps, but maybe we should be talking about hydrogen.
We should be talking about everything.
Can you understand why people are confused?
You know, there's
about
a reason why Mr. Gutierrez says everything, everywhere, all at once. And there's a reason why we have to have lots of different solutions, because Scotland is not a homogenous nation. We don't have a homogenous housing stock. We've got flats, we've got crofts, we've got granite houses, we've got houses that are off the gas grid, we've got houses that are hard to heat and need better insulation, but are made from a
other
material
countries in Scandinavia, for instance, are doing much better than us on this stuff with similar challenges.
Yeah,
Sarah Boyack.
because they're making decisions like the one that I've just suggested.
If I could say, I've actually seen what's happening in other countries, and we're way behind. We need our UK, Scottish and our councils to work together, all three levels of government. We're not getting that at the moment. We need investment. So one of the things we do is create GB Energy, base it in Scotland, go back to the discussion we've had about the electricity we're now producing, how we use that, bringing the cost of electricity down. We would have a local power plan to encourage and incentivise local authorities to have local community heat and power networks. We've got one in Aberdeen, the Aberdeen Heat and Power Network's been going for 20 odd years. It doesn't do the whole city, but for those tenants and owners, it works really well. We've got solar energy in Edinburgh. We've got bits and pieces. We don't have a joined-up approach. So we'd support local authorities and we'd work with homeowners. And one of the things we do is to make sure you've got a link to local jobs as well, because you need to do the energy retrofitting to make people's houses easier to heat and warm. And that needs financial support. So having GB Energy starting to generate extra money to invest, that would make a huge difference, and also work with our local authorities, because different areas, different opportunities.
And that would be based here in Aberdeen, is the vision.
We've not said the election's not here yet.
Well, here's your chance.
Yeah, I've got a queue of people saying, here's exactly why it should go here.
Makes sense here, though, wouldn't it?
So the other thing I was going to say is, in different parts of Scotland, you've got community heat networks, and I've seen them in Clydebank and in Midlothian, where the council owns the project, works with the private sector, many of whom are actually publicly owned companies that work in Scotland. So there's an issue about consumers, there's about bringing our bills down. We need organisation that we're not getting.
Right.
We need ambition.
Okay,
that's missing.
Let's hear from the man in the blue sweater there. Yes.
I haven't heard anyone on the panel. Everyone's got pie-in-the-sky ideas about what we could do, what we might do. One thing nobody's mentioned is nuclear. Why not?
Okay. Well, we might bring that into our final question tonight. Your views on all of this. The hashtag is BBCDN. And our final question tonight comes from Comfort EU Hazy. Comfort, where are you? Evening.
Thank you very much. Actually, evening.
Okay, sorry. You go.
Okay, my question is, can the minor changes in ordinary citizens' lives really make a difference, or do some major policy changes need to be put into effect as soon as possible? We've all talked about what people like us can do, you know, immediately to lower our carbon emissions. But we all know that a small percentage of the world is responsible for some of the largest carbon emissions. So what policy changes can you put into place that will directly affect those people?
What would you like to see?
First of all, cut down on private jets. We all talk about demonizing cars. And that affects people like us. I don't own a car, but I've
private
bombed a
jet.
ride. Yeah, I've bombed a ride from my friends with cars, and I don't think I've bombed a ride in a private jet before. So we all know the carbon emissions of private jets. And what can you say, or what can you do? What policies can you put into place to target that sector, or that sector of the population?
Thank you. Sepi, given the big impact made by things like that, and what's going on in China at the moment, and we see in India as well, can the minor changes that we're talking about tonight actually make any big difference to the picture?
Well, hold on, we're not talking about minor changes. We're talking about having a decarbonised electricity system by 2035 in this country. If we make the right choices now, if we get the international investment into offshore wind, into hydrogen, and incidentally not for boilers, I would say. Hydrogen for home heating, last week the National Infrastructure Commission said it's far too expensive. If you think heat pumps are expensive, hydrogen for home heating is through the roof. So the thing is that we can attract the investment. Investors have had a relationship with the UK because we went early. We started to get these markets off the ground. And so that's what we need to focus on. And on hydrogen, I was just desperate to come in on that point because the reality is the hydrogen industry really needs to stop trying to grab every single part of the market. Focus on what we need and what can be developed up here in the northeast of Scotland.
But just on Comfort's point,
for industry.
If we achieve net zero by 2045 by our target, it's not going to stop global warming. I mean, we're less than 1% of emissions here in Scotland. What difference is it going to make?
Yes, absolutely. A few points to that. OK, you're talking as if reaching net zero is a burden and not an opportunity. We are talking about the depleting reserves that we have in the northeast and the North Sea. We have an opportunity to get investment in here to build the industries of the future, to keep our economy running. So it's an opportunity. The second thing I'd say is 1/3 of countries across the world are 1% of emissions, okay? Half of global emissions come from countries that each on their own have less than 3% of emissions on their own. So imagine if all of them said they weren't going to do anything, you know, we wouldn't be getting anywhere. And the reality is that China and India, they're moving. China is now the biggest offshore wind market. China is the biggest electric vehicles market around the world.
All right.
So I think we just need to stop framing this as a burden. Yes, we need to make changes. If we make the right decisions now, we will reap the benefits in our economy for the future.
Is Sepi right on that?
Yeah, I mean, we need to do the big things. We also need to do the small things. This is about kind of the complete change of how we balance. 3 countries in the world do 50% of all the emissions, right? You look at China, USA and India, 50% of the emissions. If you don't get these 3 countries there, you're not going to get it. The UK is 1.2%, 1.1%. Scotland is 0.1%. You know, it's not a big element. But we can make a contribution as well. And that, I think, is really important. Back to your question. You know, we can actually think about what happened in Germany when the gas was switched off from Russia. They actually took out 15 or 20% of demand in one go. Yeah, it's about putting our thermostat a bit lower. I mean, actually, we now actually be really mindful in my own house around we don't put the hot water on in the evening, only in the morning. You know, we're actually looking at how we use what light bulbs we use in our house. We're actually making conscious choices around how we travel. You know, we've got e-bikes to go to if we want to do something. I got a hybrid car to drive anywhere. We can make personal choices of what we want to do. And everybody does that. 8.5 billion or 8 billion people in the world by the time we get there, that makes a big difference. But we need also the big countries to make the big stuff happening. And that is, I think, it's a combination of technology, lifestyle, but mainly behavior.
Thank you. Gentleman in the glasses.
We hear a lot of platitudes from our leaders when it comes to climate change and carbon emission, but they ignore an elephant in the room at their peril, and that is the military-industrial complex. Nobody talks about the effect on climate change of the wars that are raging at the moment and that are being enabled by the military-industrial complex. If you bomb towns and buildings and mosques and hospitals and demolish concrete buildings, what happens is that the cement industry prospers because these buildings will need to be rebuilt. And if the cement industry was a single country, it would be the most prosperous and profitable country in the world. Stop the wars. That's what we need to do in order to help our future generations. Nobody cares about the people who are dying, but at least think about our own grandchildren's future and stop the military-industrial complex. That is the major cause.
Thank you. Thank you. Lady up there. Yes. On you go.
So, thank you. That's a good point. The cement industry, indeed, is responsible for 7% of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. But back to the point that we were talking to our politicians here. If you look at the USA and you look at China, the reason why they're ahead is because it's a combination of elements. It's investment and also it's policy. So I'm talking to our politicians as our politicians. How much are you willing to invest in our renewable energy? You've seen in America, the IRA, I should call it the IRA, it's in the $300 billion. And that really pushed renewable energy and innovation in that country.
Right.
China, the same thing. They have the whole supply chain.
Okay, there's the challenge,
in the
Gillian
country.
Martin. Are you prepared to make that scale of investment required?
So, we don't have the same economy as the US, but in the Scottish budgetary terms, for the next year, 23-24, we're investing 2.2 billion of our funding in the twin crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change. So that's a substantial part of the Scottish Government. But I also want to answer the question originally from the lady that asked it about what we've got to offer.
Let her finish her point.
But what we've got to offer in terms of addressing climate change across the globe. In the same way that the North East in particular went round the globe with our expertise and our innovation in oil and gas back in the 70s and 80s, we can do the same again, particularly in floating offshore wind. We're one of the first movers on floating offshore wind. We've got a real opportunity with ScotWind. When we've built all the ScotWind developments, and we will then be able to have a workforce that will be able to go around the globe and advise other countries who are only at the start of their offshore wind journey.
Okay. Sarah Boyack.
Yeah, I was going to go back to the very first question, what can we do? One thing we could do in Scotland is to think about the waste that we produce and to recycle our products, not throw things out, to design things differently. We're discussing a circular economy bill in Parliament at the moment, and in Wales they have massively increased their recycling, but they've got a much more community-based approach. The government invested about £1 billion over a decade with our councils, so it enables people to recycle at home. They've got a much more joined-up approach, and it starts meaning that you can reuse your glass, you can reuse things that we would otherwise throw out, and I think there's a really big environmental problem caused by rubbish.
We're short on time here. Leeuw, Kerr, in 1 minute, can minor changes make a difference here, or do we need to do much bigger things?
Yes, I believe they can. Minor changes, as you put it, can make a difference. And I actually think people want to. I think people need to be shown that the Scottish Government understands that. And so I go back to, I think Gillian actually made good points earlier about heat in buildings. So the Minister, not Gillian Martin, but the Minister will not countenance anything other than air source heat pumps for off-grid properties. So I had quite a big argument with him about looking at biofuels. He won't even countenance it. And this gentleman brought up nuclear, and he was quite right to do so, because what we need to see in this country is a genuine energy mix. That is what will and a genuine conversation about what we want our energy generation to look like. To my mind, that is the North Sea. That is a fair and managed transition to renewables, but that also very much includes nuclear. Unfortunately, the Scottish Government has set its face against nuclear and will not countenance that.
Final thoughts before we end here tonight. Hands down for a second. Who believes, having heard what you've heard tonight, we will reach net zero in Scotland by the target 2045? Hands up if you believe it's possible. 2 people. Well, there's the challenge for us all, and that's why we will return to this subject again. That's it, though, for tonight. And for this series, we'll be back in the new year. Full list of future locations on our website soon. If you missed any of tonight's show, we're repeated on BBC One Scotland a bit later, or you can watch any time that suits you on the BBC iPlayer. Thank you very much indeed to my panel here tonight, and to our audience in Aberdeen, and to you at home for watching. We'll see you next year. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well. From all of us in Debate Night, good night.